I really have enjoyed this book. I have just a few little marks in it. Um, and I started with the bibliography at the back because I was curious about when the material was gathered. So there's material here in the bibliography from 1941 to the present. And so when you're looking at a researcher, you have to use the old research because it's important and true. And then you look at newer research to find the different ways that we've discovered even more information that we might not have been aware of before. This is, yeah. And, you read it a few times in the book, and it didn't hit me quite so hard until I got into the last third of the book, I think. Just the idea that, not important. But, girls have heard that for a very long time, and most of us just say something like, well, you wouldn't be here without a female. Think about it. Women are pretty important, and Sonia Purnell does a great job. She's a British journalist and best-selling writer. She's worked for The Economist, which is actually a magazine I like to read because it's so brainy and it makes me feel like I understand a little bit about money and investments and income and outgo and all of that. She's also worked for the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Times. She's really articulate. On her website, she says she's known for her lively writing style and meticulous research, and certainly that's true. She has an early book called Just Boris, A Tale of Blonde Ambition, about the current PM in Great Britain. It was written when he was mayor. Her second book was Clementine, a story of Winston Churchill's career by way of his wife, Clementine. And that's also been optioned for a movie. I didn't look that one up today, but so far 2 movies have been made on Virginia Hall, at least for the regular movie market. You could go to YouTube and type in A Woman of No Importance. There's a full hour-and-a-half video that you can watch. The writer talks about her work. And there are several others, including a short documentary from the International Spy Museum. So I would say probably in the last 15 years, more and more interest has been generated about the World War II era. I think it started really when maybe Tom Brokaw wrote now I'm going to blank out the... Thank you. Yes, that book. But it was something I think those of us who were raised by World War II generation folks really understand. And as I read this, I was grateful my mother wasn't involved because she would have been screaming. I know. She would have been very uncomfortable, but my dad would have been that stoic face that he would sometimes put on when I knew that he'd been having a bad night because something had helped him recall what had happened during the war. And he was sitting on an atoll in the South Pacific waiting for orders. So for somebody who had been farming all his life, it was really difficult for him. And when he came back, equally difficult. When I was a little girl, you couldn't wake him up if he was napping unless you stood at his feet. And I learned that if you sang songs he didn't like, he would wake up. So I sang the Beatles. He did not like She Loves You. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Didn't like that. But I woke him up, and, I had a method. He would sometimes stare out the picture window at night and, smoke cigarettes. And the reason we moved here was to get away from the snow. He would not have been happy 3 weeks ago. He would have been cursing again. But I'm glad I learned how to shovel snow all those years ago. This book has received the Plutarch Prize, which is a prize awarded every year by an organization of biographers. And these are pretty notable historians and writers. So they pick a 2019 book and award it for 2020. So we'll see what this year's book is. I did not look that up either. But I'm fascinated by the content and the amount of research in this book. It is amazing. And then there's pages and pages of pictures, which help put you in the place. Oddly enough, in the last 3 weeks, the movie stations have segued in a lot of World War II movies, and I find myself watching every single one about the resistance, including one called The Resistance, but it's about Marcel Marceau, who is also working in the very same region that Virginia Hall is working in, and is threatened by Klaus Barbie, the same Nazi that is hunting Virginia Hall. And you begin to see how some of the planning crosses over. And then when the book reminds you that the resistance is comprised of regular people, not military people, I think that the idea of what they're doing becomes even more immense. A few years ago, I was able to go to Normandy, and we were at the museum, and they show movies. So we watched a 40-minute movie, and when we got up to leave, there was a large contingent in the audience of folks probably 15 or so years older than me, but they stopped the students that were with me asking, were they American? And did your grandfather serve? Did your father serve? Where did they serve? And any student whose family member had been in France whatsoever, there were so many grateful thank yous, and I just had no idea. But when you look at the pictures of the total annihilation of cities, of buildings, in America, we really didn't understand that level of devastation, only perhaps if you lived in Honolulu. Oddly enough, I have a professor friend who was a kid, and he was they were in the outskirts of town. His dad was a cook for the military, and the morning of the Pearl Harbor disaster, he was in the yard, and he could see the faces of the pilots as the planes flew by. And so he's 86, I think now, but it's still a very pronounced memory for him. I guess the Plutarch is the only biography award that exists in the world, and this particular group of individuals note that this is a person of relative obscurity for a lot of different reasons. First, she's a woman, and second, we don't want to give all our secrets away. Now that it's past her 100th birthday, I think that a lot of this material has become much easier to get a hold of. So Purnell retraces Virginia Hall's concealed life. She exposes the perils and betrayals that the woman faces, including all the misogyny in and out of her work. And it's not misogyny just at the hands of men, but even women don't think that she's capable of doing what she does. Adjectives used to describe her: vulnerable, reckless, and ruthless. Virginia Hall emerges as a character of some complexity, an American woman who survives behind enemy lines in Nazi-occupied France with a wooden leg, a questionable French accent, and ends up setting up spy networks for Churchill's government, refusing to evacuate as the Gestapo closes in. And the book, all in all, really talks in a very deep way about the role of women in warfare. And so it's not flying a plane, but espionage is pretty serious business. This is a really weighty book. I had to stop and start. The cast of characters is pretty big. I had to go back and double check the list at the front a few times. But what I'm going to do today really is kind of focus on Virginia rather than all of the characters that she deals with. And because I could talk about this all day perhaps, and we don't want to do that. We just want to spend 45 minutes together and have a little bit of fun. This is not a bedtime read. This is sitting up in the afternoon, perhaps with a cup of coffee or tea and some curiosity. I would recommend the book, but again, chop it up and sometimes just look at family pictures versus the pictures of her paramilitary coworkers. Interestingly, even though this is really a documentary in writing, right, a biography, Purnell includes 3 different epigraphs at the beginning from a resistance leader and poet, from Hannah Arendt, and from Robert Kennedy. Excuse me. All of them are pretty profound, but I think Kennedy's quotation is really where the book goes. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls. And so, perhaps had he just said each time a human stands up for, we could include everyone. Also, the map at the beginning of the text is really helpful. If you have a good memory for particular parts of a map, that's great too. But to be able to see this very small area, really, in which she works and travels is really important. Purcell says that her work is that of a detective, that she's sorting through and reading everything that she can accumulate. She wants to create a realistic manuscripts, describe a superlative operative, and through the knowledge of her efforts during and after the war, she wants us to come to some understanding of the importance of a woman of no importance. At the age of 34, Virginia's mission marked a turning point after years of cruel rejection. For her own sake, as much as for the casualties she was picking up from the battlefields and ferrying to the hospitals, she could not fail again. There were many reasons why she was willingly jeopardizing her life far from home in aid of a foreign country, when millions of others were giving up. Perhaps foremost among them was that it had been so long since she had felt so thrillingly alive. Disgusted at the cowardice of deserters, she could not understand why they would not continue the fight, but then she had so little to lose. The French still remembered sacrificing a third of their young men to the Great War, and a nation of widows and orphans was in no mood for more bloodshed. Virginia, though, intended to go to the end wherever the battle took her. She was prepared to take whatever risks, face down any dangers. Total war against the Third Reich might perversely offer her one last hope of personal peace. So she's a tomboy, she's a debutante, her parents are well-to-do, but there's no plumbing in the house. And maybe that's not so very strange for the time, but she just doesn't want to be a traditional person. And it's not that she doesn't have opportunities. She's just different to begin with. Virginia was a human being with flaws, fears, and insecurities of the rest of us, maybe even more, but they helped her understand her enemies. Only once did her instincts let her down with catastrophic consequences. For the most part, though, she conquered her demons and won the trust, admiration, and ultimately the gratitude of thousands in the process. To meet Virginia was clearly never to forget her. Controversy still rages about women fighting alongside men on the front line, but nearly 8 decades ago, Virginia was already commanding men deep in enemy territory. She gambled again and again with her own life, not out of fervent nationalism for her own country, but out of love and respect for the freedoms of another. She blew up bridges and tunnels and tricked and traded, and like 007, had a license to kill. What she pursued was a very modern form of warfare based on propaganda, deceit, and the formation of an enemy within, techniques now increasingly familiar to us all. But her goals were noble. She wanted to protect rather than destroy, to restore liberty rather than remove it. She neither pursued fame nor glory, nor was she granted it. So we learn in this book that the ruse of immersion, despite odd characteristics, is possible, that guarded tongues are key to survival, and indeed that female operatives are courageous and effective. And Hall is a standout even among all the rest. Who would have thought this woman would one day become the most persistent spies of World War II? And it's interesting, she's kind of a C student. She goes to school, she goes to Radcliffe and Barnard, but she's not very happy there. She needs something more challenging in the real world, not in a book. But she's not unhappy reading books. She's just happier doing other things. By age 19, she follows social norms, becoming engaged, but she's disenchanted by her fiancé's cheating and entitlement, and she breaks off their relationship during the rebellious 1920s. Young ladies such as Virginia had long been expected to defer to their menfolk, but now rebellion was in the air. With the advent in Baltimore, as elsewhere, of the independence-loving flappers, they were a new breed of young women who broke the Prohibition-era rules on drinking and scandalized their elders by cutting their hair short, smoking, and dancing to jazz. They rejected the one-sided restrictions of a traditional marriage and were taking a more active role in politics, not the least because in 1920, American women had been granted the vote. Virginia looked around her. Home life was stifling, but the outside world seemed to offer new freedoms. And so, to her fiancé's evident indignation, she ditched him. It turned out to be the right call, as he later reputedly worked through 3 unhappy and adulterous marriages. And so, I suppose in her very outspoken way, she does convince her parents to support her as she moves into a new phase of her life, traveling across Europe, indulging her penchant for languages, studying in Germany, Austria, and France, and perfecting her German, French, and Italian. Finally, settling in Paris. Once she got over her heartbreak, Virginia left Europe for home a very different woman from the one who had set sail in 1926. She carried with her a lasting and burning belief in female emancipation. Her passion was to withstand all the barbarity that was to come and drove her to put her life on line to defend what she would call her second country. She'd honed her collection of 5 foreign languages, although she was never able to shake off her American drawl. She'd become unusually well-versed in European culture, geography, and politics. In Vienna, she saw fascist groups triumph during outbreaks of bloody political unrest. On trips over the border, she witnessed Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party rising fast in popularity. And further, in nearby Italy, the dictator Benito Mussolini had declared war on democracy itself back in 1925 and had been building up a police state ever since. So what she sees is of some dismay to her, and she feels really a drive to do something about it. And repeatedly in the book, Purcell tells us that she wants to do something. She has to do something. She returns to Baltimore just as her family fortune evaporates during the crash. She is also at home when her father has a heart attack and dies at a relatively young age. And soon she begins to apply for jobs, joining the American Embassy in 1931 as a consular service clerk in Warsaw with the goal of working for the U.S. State Department. She really wants to pursue a career in foreign service, and she's rewarded with a secretarial position. She is, however, closer to her ambition. It looks like, feels like, as you read this, that there are so many barriers in her way. And what's remarkable is that even though she's down, she never lets anything stop her. So 1932, she decides to go hunting in Turkey, where she's stationed at that point, to kind of take off the edge of her boredom. And she mistakenly shoots herself in the left leg. And that leads to a variety of problems: amputation, infection, sepsis, and a long, pronounced recuperative period. She is an impressive employee, and yet she feels repressed by the secretarial functions and is quite tired of that kind of work. She spends a summer at home recuperating and learning to walk wearing a wooden leg, which she calls Cuthbert. And then she secures an assignment in Venice, discovering ingenious ways to deal with her prosthesis in slippery conditions, even going so far as to hire her own gondola to get her back and forth in Venice. I can just imagine what that was like. She finds herself in what became known as a decade of lies, truth, and trust, falling victim to fear, racism, and hatred. She has a ringside seat then to extremism, propaganda, and media manipulation, which results in this yearning even more deeply to be involved in diplomatic ways to stop the rising tide of fascism. By 1939, she's restricted from further employment in the diplomatic service because she has an amputated limb, and she is barred from such service by their employment rules. By the outbreak of World War II, she's in Estonia, flies to London, begins to volunteer for a variety of activities only to be turned down. And by February 1940, she returns to Paris and joins the ambulance service in France. Virginia knew that she wanted more than anything to help her beloved France reject the acquiescence of its rulers and fight to reclaim the old freedoms. Only this could give her a longed-for purpose and relief from her darkest thoughts. She was convinced it would not be long before the French rose up again, and in the meantime, she would return to London and wait. Britain was now standing alone against Hitler, but for how long could it survive without help? To Virginia's dismay, America refused to be drawn into the war alongside her old allies. Congress would not countenance the loss of American lives for what were seen as only marginal national interests in a faraway continent, particularly so soon after the last European war. Even if diplomacy was a closed door to her, there must be another way for Virginia to prove her worth in what she saw as the battle of truth against tyranny. She had to find it. On a white hot day at the end of August 1940, an undercover British agent named George Bellows was working the dusty Spanish border town of Irun, keeping watch on the frantic comings and goings at the station. Spain was ruled by Generalissimo Francisco Franco and was teeming with Nazi informants, though officially neutral. Every day, hundreds or even thousands of refugees streamed over the frontier from France, some of whom might have had vital information on what was going on under the heel of the Third Reich. Bellows' eyes were drawn by a glamorous American making inquiries in the ticket office under the sinister glare of outsized banner portraits of Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. Intrigued, he drew closer and struck up a conversation with the young woman, who had just arrived from France and wished to take a train to Portugal to continue on from there to Britain by ship. He introduced himself as a salesman. As they got talking, Virginia recounted her extraordinary story to this reassuring companion, although she was ever selective in what she revealed. As he listened to her sharp yet impassioned account, Bellows grew astonished by Virginia's courage under fire, powers of observation, and most of all, her unqualified desire to help the French fight back. Trusting his instincts, he made the most important decision of his life, one that was to help revive hopes of an eventual Allied victory in France. When he bade Virginia farewell, he slipped her the phone number of a friend who could help her find a worthwhile new role and urged her to call him on her arrival. The number belonged to Nicholas Boddington, a senior official in the independent French or F section of a new and controversial British Secret Service. The Special Operations Executive had been approved on July 19, 1940, the day Hitler had made a triumphant speech at the Reichstag in Berlin, boasting of his victories. In response, Winston Churchill had personally ordered SOE to set Europe ablaze through an unprecedented onslaught of sabotage, subversion, and spying. In 1941, Virginia is inducted as a special agent and is faking it as a New York Post reporter using the code name Mary. And she returns to France later that year. There were, as ever in Virginia's life, further obstacles. Churchill's cabinet had forbidden women from frontline service of any sort, and government lawyers advised that women were particularly vulnerable if caught, as they were not recognized as combatants and therefore not protected by international laws on war. With SOE itself, old-fashioned attitudes were also widespread. There was considerable hostility at every level to the idea of a woman in any other than supporting roles, such as decoders, typists, and couriers. Also, as Virginia was American, could she be trusted? It was standard intelligence policy to recruit only British citizens. Her country in those pre-Pearl Harbor days was not at war with Germany and was suspiciously friendly with the Vichy regime, which was proving deeply hostile to Britain. In the end, Virginia's supporters win the day, persuading doubters that the nationality of recruits is unimportant as long as they are loyal to the anti-Nazi cause and the British war effort. Indeed, SOE decided in its desperation that it must and would be ready to work with any man, woman, or institution, whether Roman Catholic or Masonic, Trotskyist or liberal, syndicalist or capitalist, rationalist or chauvinist, radical or conservative, Stalinist or anarchist, Gentile or Jew, that would help it beat the Nazis. That's a list. And so Virginia Hall builds a defiance network in Vichy. And for the next 15 months, she is organizing, communicating with other groups, repeatedly requesting better equipment and a radio operator to no avail. Basically, she also begins funding certain parts of her duties herself and recruiting others who assist her. In particular, the Mademoiselles Fayot, whose antique shop basement stored supplies for the resistant and whose apartment sheltered agents on the run, the owner of the Lyon underwear shop La Lingerie Pratique, France Préjot, future mother of musician Jean-Michel Jarre and mother-in-law of Charlotte Rampling, who stored weapons under piles of lacy bras and hosted sweaty resistance meetings in her back room, and several hairdressers who sheltered resistance in trouble and helped them change their looks. So she's really got connections, and she expands those connections at every turn. She also recruited a forger, a highly respectable engraver in an upmarket shopping arcade called the Passage du Hôtel Dieu. Monsieur Chambillard became expert at recreating official papers for Virginia that fooled even the most eagle-eyed inspectors. He, like all her other supporters, knew that the likely price of capture was death. So Of course, as you read the book, resistance is a theme, certainly to fascism and the Nazi regime, but also resistance towards women. And so when she finds folks favorable, folks who will listen to her and heed her wise advice, things work a little bit better. But she still doesn't have the support that she needs, the finance, the equipment, or the people. And she nonetheless really pursues that. Her biggest coup is infiltrating the Ersatz Gestapo that had laid the trap at the Via de Bois, and which through its snoop ears operations expertly tracked down secret radio signals. She identified and recruited an idealistic and handsome 30-year-old Corsican officer, Marcel Leccia, who was based in Limoges, and then incredibly proceeded to enlist both his assistant and boss. Now she would most likely be warned of future traps similar to the Via de Bois, and could hope that Sûreté would be more lenient with any of her agents that they did happen to catch. She was in a good position to help, for as an American, people talk to her openly about their feelings. Even though she was only in France on a temporary mission, even though Ben Coburn is in France on a temporary mission, he visits her often and observes with amazement how unsolicited approaches from French locals provide her with steadily growing, useful contacts. She chips away at the foundation of the Vichy government and undermines the whole edifice of French acquiescence, recruiting more people in better places than anyone else. From nowhere, she now had her finger in virtually every significant French pie, and we're only 67 pages into the book. So understatement, 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 and then boom, and she's completely in charge. So it's not to say she's not capable, but so many do not want to take orders from a woman, let alone a foreign woman. And so that becomes problematic. She's also traveling extensively on the train system, and that poses security risks, accommodation problems, and you'd think that, returning to a flat wherever in Paris might be a small delight, but she continues taking risks, observing that the security police took more interest in the cheapest seats, so she made sure to book for first class. She memorized the address of where she was going rather than writing it down, and always had a plausible reason for going there worked out and rehearsed. Even so, every journey presents a mortal danger, and her wooden leg precluded the last-ditch option open to others of throwing herself off the train and running for cover. At every meeting, contacts might turn out to be double agents or traitors. They might have been caught and tortured so that the Gestapo would turn up instead. It's cold, it's miserable, and finally returning to her hotel room in Lyon, the temperature outside plummeting to 15 degrees below zero, or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. With no heating, Virginia's room was little better than standing on the street. She had to resort to blocking the drafts from the windows with old rags and lining her clothes with newspapers, which made a crackling noise when she moved to keep warm. There was a drop of hot water, but only on Sunday morning. She would also have been better protected from the epidemics of scabies in humans had she not had to travel crammed in with the other undernourished, underwashed passengers on trains. Perhaps the biggest challenge of all for her was running out of medical socks for her stump, without which her hair-raising journeys on the trains were even more of an endurance test. But as you know, she ends up hiking through the Pyrenees to get away, so having stump problems is just the beginning in this story. So the level of self-reliance in this individual is quite amazing. And again, she's She's got a horrible accent. Everybody knows that her French sounds strange, and she tries to mask that by suggesting that she's from the very, very, very north of France or other locations that might have a considered odd accent for the location. So she continues to have some problems with her coworkers, even though she's extraordinarily efficient and intelligent. They don't want to submit to the will of a woman. For Virginia, though, since losing her leg, hiding her emotions and rigid self-reliance had become second nature, terror and turmoil was better than feeling dead inside. And she says that she has never felt so free. So with all of that adrenaline and all of that challenge, probably fear for her life daily, fear for her coworkers, must have been incredible. By early 1942, she's moved to Lyon, and she is struggling there with the resistance, working under increasing pressure, and because others in the resistance are not as careful as she is, there's some fallout from their recklessness, and she is in danger off and on all the time. Her own insane and incredible risks eventually pay off, but her sixth sense is extraordinary. And when she feels something's a little hinky, she backs away and ends up saving her skin. Though the Nazis don't know her name at this point, they seek her, especially Klaus Barbie. And as a sideline, she's basically the group psychologist. Everybody brings their concerns to her, and she listens and tries to problem solve for them. She even has sickness pills for those who are incarcerated so that they appear really ill and would have to go to a hospital for treatment. And invariably, those hospitals are escape sites, well-managed escape sites. There is a continuing security concern for her life, for the rest of the novel or for the rest of the biography. But she seems to balance things out pretty well. At first, it had been an advantage to be a woman working undercover, particularly a handsome one who could use her charms to distract or deceive. Most Germans fed propaganda on how women's lives should revolve around Kinder, Kirche, Küche, had assumed that such fragile figures would hardly get involved in something as dirty and dangerous as the resistance. But as Virginia was fully aware, the Nazi line had now changed dramatically. The Gestapo had discovered more and more local women were playing an active role, many as couriers ferrying money, messages, or weapons. Couriers often carried incriminating items, heavy and light, but they also kept a lot in their heads, including agents' names and addresses. If caught, women were therefore deliberately subjected to some of the worst forms of torture the depraved Nazi mind could devise. And I'm not going to read that to you. That's why you don't read this at night. You don't want to influence your dream state. There are other master spies who recognize that women's ability is far superior to men's, but I guess that's not broadly shared. And there's certainly other things that need to be taken care of. Towards the end of 1942, the Germans are really working at shutting down the resistance, and the limping woman seems to be a theme that is consistently recognized. She escapes to Spain, just as her identity, her name, and her circuits are verified. And the Germans are furious. They just can't find her. Klaus Barbie is incensed and ready to act out, certainly. But she is relying on her sixth sense and manages to save her skin. So the Pyrenees are beautiful. I can't imagine walking through them day after day. There's a passage later in the book where a marathon runner takes the same route and walks through the Pyrenees, and he can hardly make it. So he can't put his mind around the idea that in the snow, a woman with a wooden leg is managing to get through the passes and down into Spain. So to some level of safety. They huddled together to keep warm, but even here she had to hide her prosthetic leg and her blood-drenched sock. It's likely that it was at this point she sent out a now legendary message to London, perhaps with one of the new lighter radios hidden in her bag, or maybe a set that had been stowed away in a hut. It read, "Cuthbert is being tiresome, but I can cope." The duty officer who took her message in the receiving station in a large country house near Sevenoaks in Kent had no idea to whom she was referring. "If Cuthbert is tiresome," he signaled back, "have him eliminated." So she is, as ever, managing. Still, she is undervalued. Still a primary target of the Nazis, even as she is released from being held. She doesn't have the proper paperwork to pass into Spain. And she's tired of Madrid. They give her another desk job, and she's bored to tears. Nonetheless, and I guess not fully recognizing it, she's still a primary target for the Nazis. They are looking for her. It's at this point she goes back to London and enrolls in wireless school. But she has much more up her sleeve. Virginia's return was not an entirely comfortable landing. Many agents on their homecoming from a country overrun by Nazis found the atmosphere in England strangely complacent, even though only 2 days earlier another huge air raid in London had left whole streets in piles of rubble. Virginia's return to headquarters was almost inevitably an anticlimax. Of course, she had the time to recover properly physically and to take Cuthbert to the specialist prosthetic unit at Queen Mary's Hospital in Roehampton to be fixed and the rivets redone. William Simpson accompanied her as he was having a false hand fitted, and as they talked, he marveled at what she had achieved. "For the life of me, I cannot conceive how it was possible," he exclaimed about her escape over the Pyrenees. Yet she was a picture of health and abounding good spirits. From March 1944, she began to serve in Special Operations Branch of the OSS and is sent back to France yet again. On the moonless night of March 21st, 1944, a small advance guard for the forthcoming Allied invasion of northern France was deposited on Bégonfray Beach in Brittany. The hand-picked duo had dashed across the English Channel in a Royal Navy motor gunboat after spending the previous night in a hotel near the seaside resort of Torquay. One was an elderly peasant woman bound up in shawls like a Russian babushka and carrying a heavy suitcase. She was the first to land, silently maneuvering herself out of the camouflage dinghy onto the rocks and away from the rising tide. So she lands in her disguise. She had dyed her hair a dirty gray and secured it with a wooden hairpin in a severe upstyle that sharpened her features. Hollywood makeup artists had taught her how to pencil in authentic-looking wrinkles around her eyes. Baggy woolen blouses and several floor-length skirts with peplums bulked out her silhouette and concealed her Colt 32, and she had her fine white American teeth ground down by a much-feared female London dentist to resemble those of a French countrywoman. At 5'8", she was tall for a peasant, but her clothes had been made, distressed, and rigorously checked by Jewish refugees in a secret atelier behind London's Oxford Circus to make sure they looked real, right down to the way the buttons were sewn on, as the French favored parallel threading while the British and Americans preferred a crisscross pattern. She even altered her famous gait by learning how to shuffle. The Gestapo had given her the code name of Artemis, the Greek goddess of hunting, and for them, tracking her down for the kill still represented a particularly gripping, if sinister, sport. Her pursuers knew she'd returned to Britain via Portugal. Now they must be prevented at all costs from finding out she was back in France. In the U.S. military, which had been hurriedly expanded after Pearl Harbor, female recruits who never got near the front line alone behind it were branded by some male colleagues as prostitutes or the so-called lesbian threat. Women were known to fly fighter aircraft, but only to and from the factories and never into combat. Normally, the closest women got to shooting was as nurses. Taking orders in the field from the untested Aramis was hardly a situation, however, that Virginia was likely to tolerate for long, nor was she likely to stick to her restrictive support role brief. From the get-go, she had greater ambitions now that she was finally back in France and scores to settle. She can't parachute in because she has a wooden leg, so they bring her in on a boat. And she has a new series of IDs with her. This time, her French ID is Marcel Montaigne, but also she has the code name Diane at this time. That's a tough thing to keep track of, but the thing that the list in the front is really helpful in the book in that way. It's just interesting the number of people that she works with, and the energy of the book. I feel like it imitates her energy somehow, and it leaves out a lot of her grief. I mean, it's there, but it's so subtle and quiet. It feels like you recognize that she doesn't have time to really think about what's missing, what's lost. She has time to move forward. And I think the author's done a great job providing that for us. In terms of the D-Day area where she is working in the final, I guess, year and a half or so, she manages to set up all kinds of situations reflective of the earlier activities, and she is kind of beloved among the French people there. And still, the book says that she is remembered with a great deal of consideration and pride. They feel that she is one of them because she did, in fact, become one of them as a distraction. She further manages to inform the Allies that the Germans are relocating their headquarters from Lyon to Le Puy, and then she assists in training guerrilla resistance forces, in the war against the Germans. And these, towards the end of the war, the intensity, of course, expands. Thanks to Virginia, the French had saved themselves. Teachers, farmers, schoolboys, and factory workers, financed, organized, armed, and often directed by her, had liberated the area without professional military help. They defeated the Germans 2 days before the Allied armies even reached Paris, let alone freed some or most of the rest of France, where the battle was still raging. She cabled London with the news and asked for new orders. It was in officially recording her truly amazing performance in the region that SOE files mentioned for the first time her prosthetic leg. So all that history of service, and it's in 1944 when they finally actually record that she has a prosthetic leg. What they could not have known at this point, and which was not to be revealed for another 44 years, was that Virginia's work had also helped pave the way for the Allied recapture of Paris. According to a 1988 report in Army, the Association of the United States Army's magazine, her intelligence on the disposition and direction of the German 7th Army from her time as a milkmaid in central France and thereafter had been vital. Her reports had been used to direct specific aerial reconnaissance and eventually, the magazine explained, help the Americans to locate and trap the bulk of opposing German forces in the so-called Falaise Pocket in the Calvados countryside west of Paris. The engagement cost the Nazis up to 100,000 men killed or captured and became the decisive Allied breakthrough in the Battle of Normandy more than 2 months after D-Day. Just 3 days later, on August 24th, Paris was cleared of the enemy and became a free city again for the first time in more than 4 years. Another moment when Virginia's efforts played an unsung role in the progress of the war. And here, as we wind into the end of the book, Virginia, being Virginia, still had more to prove. So she's just not done. She's really astounding and different. You know, we know that Julia Child was with the OSS, and she had a secretarial sort of position. So maybe Virginia is Julia Child on steroids or something. She's just huge. And for those of us who are a little bit romantic at heart, she does develop a long-standing relationship beyond soldier with one of her operatives, and for some time does not marry him, much to her mother's chagrin, and then does marry him. But that's after they're back at home in the United States. Her group, though very effective, is ordered to disband to allow professional soldiers to complete the war. Her co-workers felt a deep sense of loss when they were to part from this impressive Englishwoman who breathed energy and determination, but who remained a mystery to them all. We didn't know anything about her. The group melted away, and we never saw the woman we called Madonna again. To capture the final hours together, they posed for a photograph on a balcony. As commander and the only woman, Virginia stands at the center of the group, hair pinned up in tie, khaki trousers, and jacket. Gabriel is on her left, but for once his infectious grin is missing. Once the initial shock had passed, candles were lit, Paul cooked up the last of the rations, and the wine cellar was raided. After dinner, one of the young irregulars played the piano, and Virginia joined in the singing of bawdy Navy songs. She felt compelled to return to where her job had begun. Happiness in her personal life had not blinded her to the tragedy that had befallen her friends in Lyon and other places where she'd operated across 1,000 miles of war-torn road. American troops were enraging many resistance by supplying their German prisoners of war with cigarette rations when the French had for so long been deprived of anything to smoke and still had precious little. There was a widespread fear that, never having witnessed the realities of life Under the Nazi heel, Americans were obstinately incredulous of the depths of barbarity suffered in France, and therefore too lenient with those responsible. Virginia was the rare American who had seen and shared it. She had not forgotten those everyday warriors who had risked their lives to help fan the flames of resistance, and she now found out just how heavy the toll had been. And the book does reveal all this to you pretty consistently when people disappear or die. Far worse than the damage visited on such a beautiful city, however, was the pain inflicted on its people. The glory of Lyon's defiance of 1941 and 42 had been replaced, even as peace descended, by a pale despair at what had been lost. So many of Virginia's army of helpers had been deported to the hell of German death camps, and too many never came back. Even those who had been liberated by the Allies were wraiths. They were ill, weak, and hungry. They had lost everything to Nazi looters. After the war was over, Virginia Hall begins working as an intelligence analyst on French parliamentary affairs in the Special Activities Division of the CIA, retiring in 1966 due to a mandatory retirement age at 60. Her experience and ability never fully realized by the CIA. She is, however, highly decorated for her courageousness with a Distinguished Service Cross, the Croix de Guerre, and the MBE. She is recognized as one of the most effective spies of World War II. She now had time to decorate, inspired by the chateaus and Venetian palazzi she'd seen on her travels. Guests, including her old supporters from the CIA, were entertained in the light-flooded sitting room with its glassed area at one end. Virginia had a knack for keeping her closest friends throughout her life, and now at last she could spend some real time with them. She finally went easy on herself, moving to a ground-floor bedroom so that she would no longer have to face the pain of negotiating stairs. She built a new greenhouse, grew vegetables, especially her beloved Jerusalem artichokes, and planted thousands of daffodils for a display of spring cheer. They also kept particularly vicious geese, pushing them away from the house when needed with a broom and ultimately making them, or at least their livers, into foie gras. The couple even tried to replicate French cheese with milk from their herd of goats, although one batch went wrong and began to stink to high heaven on the porch. Cooking together was a favorite occupation, and after dining, Virginia would weave cloth on an old-fashioned hand loom. So they really returned to a kind of idyllic sort of life, but I've compressed a lot here. I haven't really talked about her conflicts with her mom, because Virginia's not being very ladylike, not being very traditional. And when Virginia moves to New York with Paul and they're not married yet, she just, mom's just going to have to deal. I'm far enough away. She doesn't see us every day. It's all going to be fine. But she does eventually marry Paul. They lived on a farm in later life in Barnesville, Maryland, and until their deaths. There are, as I've said, 2 movies that have been made about Virginia Hall. One after this book, A Woman of No Importance, and another, A Call to Spy. 3 books have been published in the past several years, and they're not the only ones that mention Virginia Hall. But her experience intrigues us because we're considering that women demonstrate valor and courage that is heroic, and we look to history to find a few more of those women as examples. The executive director of the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., Peter Ernest, a 35-year veteran of the CIA, says she's extraordinarily brave. His museum houses a permanent exhibit on Hall, which includes the suitcase radio she used to send messages to London in Morse code, along with her British Empire Medal and some of her ID papers. Her Distinguished Service Cross resides at the CIA Museum in McLean, Virginia, and there are portraits of her in the CIA proper. But most of us won't be allowed to see those that are at the CIA, but we can visit the Spy Museum. If you haven't finished the book, I would urge you to do so, but, take it bit by bit, enjoy it, think about it. My maternal grandmother was born in 1898, so reading about a woman that's this strong who was born in 1901 definitely reminds me of my grandma. Now, she was pretty traditional, but she also did non-traditional things, so made the comparison easy for me. She owned real estate and was a nutritionist, and she did stuff that women of her time didn't necessarily do. So she even owned property here in San Antonio while she still lived in Ohio. Not my grandpa, my grandmother had the rental property. So all those crazy ideas about women not really taking hold of things is probably less true than we might believe, because women just don't blow their own horns about it. They just go on about their business, which is exactly what Virginia does. Okay, I've got a desk job and I'm just going to handle it and enjoy the rest of my life. I hope you've enjoyed the book. Now I want to read more of Sonia Purnell's work, and I'm excited to learn what you all have for selections for next year's series. Thank you for your attention and your time. I appreciate it very much.